Chapter 17 is Fire Attack for the Fire Officer. The objectives with this chapter, we're going to look at the results of the full-scale structure fire experience conducted by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, and also the Underwriters Laboratories, or UL. We'll talk about the fire officer's role in supervising a single company. We're going to look at and describe how to size up the incident. We're going to look at how to develop an incident action plan, and we're going to talk about the tactical safety considerations when we're fighting fires. Structural firefighting is a practice that is built upon experience and experiments. And so in recent findings, we have found that that these things have changed our understanding of fire dynamics. More recently, we have talked about completing flow paths and some different things there in tactical ventilation. We identified the importance of controlling the flow path, and then we've changed our ventilation practices in relation to our interior firefighting practices. In our new graph, we have the fire experiments in 1908 led to the development of the time temperature curve, which we know best, and when we talk about, or we have in the past, we've talked about flashover in this time temperature curve. And at the time, fires within a structure were fuel limited. With the recent experiments have shown that modern fires are ventilation limited, not fuel limited, and so this resulted in a much different time temperature curve. Modern fires versus legacy fires in single-family dwellings. 4 factors distinguish modern fires versus legacy or in the single-family dwelling. We're building larger homes is one. 2, open house geometry, so open floor plans and the use of more laminated beam and lightweight truss construction. And then the increased fuel loads. We have more things across the board as in the past. And then again, these new construction materials, we're using laminated beams, we're using lightweight truss construction in our flooring and also in our roofs and different areas to span these more open type floor plans. Modern versus legacy, again, when we are talking about in the terms of flashover in the modern timeline, you can see here that we are reaching flashover in much faster time frame than in the legacy timeline. The time of collapse or an unprotected floors versus the protected floors, we see the same thing along this curve. So within 30 minutes of a working fire in a single family dwelling that's been involved this long, we can have total collapse of an unprotected floor, whereas we look at the bottom timeline, which is our legacy timeline, and we go well past almost up to an hour and even past an hour in this time of collapse. And that's simply the things that furnishings and building construction materials, what everything is made out of today is a lot of synthetics, a lot of synthetic fiber, a lot of synthetic materials that are petroleum products. We have a lot of plastics in our home now as compared to the time frame of when legacy structures are built. So when we jump forward to our time frame, we realize that things have drastically changed. And so, there's a lot of times that we don't make it on scene of a fire until we're 10, maybe even 15 minutes in, depending on the distance away and the time of day and possibly who's called in this fire. So the flow path is the volume between an inlet and an exhaust that allows heat and smoke to move from a higher pressure area then towards a lower pressure area. And much in the way that wind works, wind or air moves from higher pressure to lower pressure. When combating ventilation limited compartment fires, it is best that we control the access door. And by doing so, we control this flow path. We're not letting as much air in, and we're also not letting an exhaust of hot, warm gases out and smoke. It's much less when we control the door. We apply water before vertical ventilation and apply 30 to 90 seconds of water. We flow and this can be also done from the outside at a steep angle towards the ceiling through a window or an opening. And we flow for this amount of time and we'll darken it down, and basically we use the term as resetting the fire. You cannot make a big enough ventilation hole. We've got to get, when we're ventilation limited, we've got to get water on these fires. Operations that are conducted in the flow path place firefighters at significant risk. So within that path, we have to realize that we have hot air and smoke coming out the top of an opening. And then you'll be drawing in cooler air from the outside because of the difference in pressures from at the bottom of that opening. And so we are completing that path. And we can really, by the great influx of air and oxygen coming in at the bottom, we'll complete the path, and it's possible that we're in that path in between that and the fire, all the while we're trying to seek out and extinguish this fire. So when we're dealing with single companies, the fire officer is the working supervisor of the fire company. And we may be broken down into engine companies, rescue companies, ladder companies. You may, if you belong to a smaller fire department and or a volunteer fire department, you may be using all of these functions, as one pumper arrives, you'll be doing all these types of jobs. But the single supervisor is that company officer. Closeness of the supervision, the level of supervision should be balanced with the experience level of the members in the company and the nature of the assignment. The level of supervision is also affected by the location of the task as well. Situational leadership, we need to adopt the appropriate leadership style for the situation. In the non-emergency situations, a participative leadership is appropriate, but we have to realize a lot of times in the emergency incident itself, decisions are needed and they're needed quickly, and this is when we take on more of an autocratic role. Standardized actions, emergency operations must be conducted in a structured and a consistent manner. Strong emphasis we place on standard operating procedures. And, different departments will differ in some of the tactical objectives. We will reach the same goal, and oftentimes in the same manner. We may do a few pieces of it differently, and some of the things that can outline that is the equipment that we have available to us, the type of apparatus, and the resources or the additional resources and mutual aid that we might have available to us as well. Command staff assignments. This is a review of the incident command portion, and this should include the safety officer who's in charge of overall safety of the fire scene and may also appoint additional safety officers if you're divided out into sectors or areas. Liaison officer and a public information officer. The fire officer working in one of these positions reports directly to the incident commander. Hence its given name, the command staff. Scene size up is a systematic process of gathering and processing information to evaluate a situation. The end result is an incident action plan or an IAP, and oftentimes this plan of action it's in our heads to begin with, unless we're on a lengthy um, a lengthy scene or incident. It doesn't initially get written down, but at some point it will, whether that be in the written run report. If we're in a lengthy operation, it may be then written down with some other tactical objectives as well. The end result is of this plan is that we have a plan in place. We know we've went offensive, we've went defensive. This is the route we're taking. An experienced officer will adjust the plan as more information becomes available, and we can adjust it up to, as an example, we went defensive, then we quickly change to offensive as more people arrive on the scene, and we realize that we can take care of this safely by using of offensive type tactics, or it could be the opposite of that. We have started with offensive. We realize we are not going to be able to put enough gallons per minute on this fast enough to get it quickly, so we're going to have to now back out, account for everyone, and then use a defensive type tactic. Pre-arrival information, the size up begins with dispatch. We begin rolling things through our mind at this point. We begin to making those decisions of what we're going to do, what we could possibly be faced with based on the information that we're being given, and this is all before we ever roll out of the fire station. Things such as the name and the location and the nature of the incident all help us as officers to anticipate what could be happening and going on the scene. When we get on scene, our observations of this scene are it's that initial size up and the things that we're looking at that help us to begin to make the proper decisions. Standard operating procedures may list the essential size up factors and the things that we're initially looking for. Certainly one of the first things on the list is for us to do a walk around of the entire structure to start looking for, is it on a walkout? Does it have a basement? Are there any dangers? Where are the utilities? So on and so forth. And that's just a small list of the things that we're looking for. The fire officer must understand and recognize basic fire dynamics. This information is needed to predict where the fire is burning and where that it may spread. Visualization is a significant factor. You have to be able to read things and even read things into the future. So in other words, if we're seeing a certain percentage of fire on side B, as an example, and we have some smoke coming from a window and we don't see any fire, we got to realize within the next couple minutes, what is that going to be like if we do nothing? All right. An understanding of fire dynamics is necessary. It's needed to help us develop these incident action plans, and a knowledge of the fuel load being an important factor. And it does depend on the type of structure that we're dealing with. And one of the things we have to realize with fuel loading today, we have more and more people who are fitting in the hoarding category. We have people who are collecting things, and they accumulate a lifetime of things and belongings, and they don't pick or have anywhere else to store these things, and they begin to pile. and they pile these things everywhere, and it gets to the point where they no longer take out trash. They no longer discard old magazines and newspapers, and so it really becomes a hindrance and an addition to the fuel load. Lloyd Layman's five-step size up process it's one that really helps us kind of remember things, and it goes through and it talks about facts, probabilities, the situation at hand, our decisions, and the plan of operation. National Fire Academy's size up process is a little shorter and a little easier to remember, and it divides us up into a pre-incident plan or pre-incident information that we may have from whether that's coming from dispatch, it's coming from information that we have put in the CAD system through our pre-plans and that kind of thing, to the initial scene size up. Once we get there, what are we seeing? We report that to incoming units as well as an ongoing size up as we repeat things and we reassess things as we move along the timeline. Risk benefit analysis. The key size up factor when selecting the appropriate strategic mode is the degree of risk that is acceptable is determined by the benefits that can be anticipated. Is this worth taking risk with, or is this not worth risking at all? And so we look back when we talk about this to Alan Brudicini, past chief of Phoenix Fire Department, who is now deceased, pioneered this risk a lot to save a lot, risk little to save little, risk none to save nothing. And he would repeat this, and throughout the years, most of us has heard this over and over again, but it certainly rings true. With our analysis, we want to determine the appropriate strategy for the incident. Are we going to use an offensive operation, or are we going to use defensive operations? Is there a need, and what time is there the need to then transition from one to the other? Your incident action plan, or your IAP, as it is sometimes called. After your size up, the incident commander will then develop an incident action plan based on the information that we have gathered both from dispatch and from our on-scene size up. The two major components of this size up is the determination of the appropriate strategy and then the development of tactics to execute that strategy. So we've picked offensive or defensive. Now, which direction are we going to go? Are we pulling hose lines, charging hose lines and making entry, or are we pulling hose lines and setting up for defensive operations? Again, we use our standard operating procedures to help guide us in these initial actions. Priorities of the incident. Number one, as we know and have been taught throughout our careers in the fire service, is life safety. The second is stabilization of the incident. Certainly, if we do nothing at all, an incident will stabilize. It'll run out of fuel and the fire will go out. But at what risk level do we jump in there and take care of business? Can we do it safely? And then conservation of property. We know that if we get into a structure and we take care of business pretty quick and we get a room and contents fire taken care of, then we're going to begin to minimize damage right away and protect some of the belongings and property. Tactical priorities. Often over the years we have taught RECIO-VS. This is something that's still being taught, and this acronym is to help us again to remember the tactical priorities during a working fire. And like we just stated, we start with rescue. The R stands for rescue. We want to remove any victims from danger if possible, and again we must make that risk versus benefit analysis. Remember, risk a lot to save a lot, risk little to save little, and risk nothing to save none. Next, we look at exposures and keep the incident from getting any bigger. We have to remember that fire nearly doubles every minute that it's let go unchecked. It has that potential. And so knowing that, realize that you have two types of exposures. You have exterior exposures, which we think of a lot in the terms of the word exposure, and that's adjacent buildings, outbuildings, and smaller structures, or even in a neighborhood where homes are closer together, other homes and dwellings that could become involved. But also realize that you have interior exposures as well, and that's the room next to the fire room. That's the room 2 rooms down from the fire room that we also want to keep from catching on fire. And then C is confinement. So we want to prevent the fire from spreading to the involved areas. That's get to it and get water on it, begin the application of water, and begin the process of extinguishing the fire. So we combine it and we get it on the road to extinguishment. That brings us to extinguishment. Our hope is to extinguish the fire and completely take care of the incident at that point. And then, if that is possible, that will push us into the overhaul stage, which is the O of RECIO. And during this phase, we make sure that the fire is completely put out. No smoke, no steam rising. We've taken care of all of the hidden fires. And essentially at this point, or the end of this operation, we have everything extinguished. Ventilation is the V in VS. This is the process where we remove heat, smoke, and products of combustion from a fire area. This is where we use the horizontal method. This is where we use the vertical ventilation. This is where we control doors. This is where we cut the holes. We do all these things in order to help exhaust smoke and superheated gases out to A, make our job better, B, make it more tenable for any victims, and help us to extinguish the fire. And that leaves us with the S of salvage and protect, or we want to remove property that could be damaged by fire, smoke, water, or firefighting operations. Tactical safety considerations. A full ensemble of protective clothing and equipment should be worn when we are exposed to the hazardous conditions of an immediately dangerous to life type atmosphere. Its weight, bulk, and thermal properties must be considered during extreme weather conditions as well. Overall scene safety, use lighting at night. This is something that we need to do early on in nighttime operations. During cold weather, spread abrasive materials about the scene. If we're using water and it's below freezing, things are going to freeze. We're going to create slip hazards for ourselves. And we can spread some oil dry down and some abrasive materials to help with this. If exposed to traffic hazards, one of the most dangerous things that we do when we're operating in the streets is be out on the street, be out on the highways when we're working car wrecks. And so the same thing, when we're out on the streets with our apparatus, you position apparatus to protect scene. Call on law enforcement to come block streets for us and to keep people out of the hot zone. Wear high visibility safety vests or jackets when appropriately. And again, request traffic control or simply blocking of streets on structure fires from our law enforcement friends. Identify hazardous areas. Divide it out into your hot warm code zone. A lot of times inside of the structure and near it is the hot zone. We get out into the front and side yards. That's the warm zones. And the cold zones is completely away from where we have rehab set up and is completely safe to gear down. Keep spare clothes on hand. It's not just in the wintertime we need to keep these clothes on hand. We need to do it all the time. Now, some of the things we're thinking about for the prevention of cancer is to clean up, keep ourselves clean, keep our skin wiped off, decontamination on the scene. In the wintertime, it is essential to get out of wet and sweaty clothes into dry clothes. And then ultimately, when we get back to the station, and that's the shower. RIC crews, or Rapid Intervention Crews, RICs, IRICs, which is Initial Rapid Intervention Crew. Initially, this is made up of 2 members from the initial attack crew. Rapid Intervention Crews typically are made of 3 to 4 members, including 1 officer, and generally positioned outside, ready to immediate action. Personnel accountability reports, or PARs, the systematic method of accounting for all personnel in an emergency incident. The fire officer physically verifies that members are indeed present within their presence. Anytime a firefighter cannot be accounted for, he or she then is considered missing until proven otherwise. And then we begin operations to find that missing firefighter. Typically, the PAR reports are done within the first 10 minutes of operations. We'll do one. The next 10 minutes we'll do one, and depending on where we're at then in the operations would dictate in the next 10 minutes of whether we're going to do another one. So with the recent experiments, we know that things have changed. We know fire dynamics, at least our thought pattern on it, has changed, and we're interested now more in controlling that flow path. Fire officers are our working supervisors. These officers need to adopt the appropriate leadership style based on the specific situation at hand. Emergency incident operations must be conducted in a structured manner. We've got to be coordinated and we have to be structured. Command staff assignments include the safety officer, again the liaison officer, and the public information officer positions. The art of sizing up an incident requires a diverse knowledge base. We have to know these things. We have to know reading smoke. We've got to know fire behavior. We have to be able to look at a structure and tell this is type 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, and this is what we're possibly dealing with. The specific size up for an incident begins right off the bat with dispatch. You're already gathering information from the dispatch. You're rolling things through your mind depending on where it's at, what type of structure, is it a business or not. All of these things are helping us to begin to make decisions right away. The ability to size up a situation quickly requires that systematic approach. We talked about using RICIO. We've talked about the 5-step process for the size up, and we looked at the National Fire Academy's version of size up. The risk benefit analysis is a key factor when selecting the strategic mode. Again, we look back on risk a lot to save a lot, risk little to save little, and risk nothing to save none. After our size up, the incident commander develops then an incident action plan, and then it's going to be based upon the incident priorities. These tactical priorities will provide the order for dealing with incident priorities. Fighting fires, we know, is inherently dangerous. And anything that we can do to minimize this danger to us, we need to do. Many departments have developed rapid intervention crew training and deployment procedures. I've seen this done a lot of different ways. For the most part, most things are similar. It's how many people do you have available to you, what type of equipment are you using, and that kind of thing. When a personal accountability report is requested, then the officer verifies that all members are present, and this gets communicated back to the incident commander.